We're going to talk about understanding students as writers, and we're going to hopefully take a developmental approach to that. And I'm going to try and make my keyboard actually advance my slides. Yay, it worked. Okay. So we've got two questions that we want to think about today. The first is a sort of a big picture question of how people develop into good writers. And we're going to talk about what actually happens inside the brain as we write and as we improve our writing. And then the sort of close-up zoomed in question that I have is how can we help individual students move forward on that developmental arc? So wherever they are, whatever they're working on, what's a good next step for them? And we're going to talk a little bit about how we communicate with students about their writing and what we can do and have them do so that they progress as writers. So my hope is that this approach will let us see a sort of universal trajectory for the vast majority of writers, but it will also give us some guidance in developing and choosing individual interventions for a specific writer at a specific point in their development. I like to start these sessions by asking people, and I'd like you to put an answer in the chat if you can take a couple of a minute or two to do that. What characteristics of your students' writing most frustrate or concern you? So if you just take a minute to think about when you are looking at a student paper, what are the sorts of things that you see that make you go, oh my gosh, I got to do something about that, or that make you worried, or that make you feel like you need to do something, you're not sure what to do. What is something that's a characteristic that you see in your students' writing that frustrates or concerns you? If you can just type that into the chat, I will have, oh good, they're all piling up down here. What I'm hoping that we'll see, I'm going to have to just kind of skim these and then we'll refer back to them, I hope, as we go along. I hope you'll see during the presentation how these concerns that you have are linked to certain developmental thresholds. Okay, so I'm just going to read through a few of them. Let's see if I can get back to the beginning. All right. Lack of organization, using simple sentences, punctuation, lack of structure. I'm not sure if that means that they are unable to use simple sentences properly or they're using simple sentences instead of complex ones. I see both concerns in different contexts. Given the same feedback every paper and them not applying it. Okay. Repetition of a big idea with no deep dive. We're going to see why that happens. Lack of clarity, punctuation, conventions, organization, details, repetition, conventions, unclear reasoning. They write the same way that they speak. We're going to talk about that. Lack of cohesiveness, using resource skills. I imagine that means like citation and looking things up. Lack of focus. So many issues, I'm not sure where to start. We'll talk a bit about that. Supported argument with hypotheticals rather than real examples. Grammar, commas. Okay, I'm starting to see things repeat. Lack of organization, right? So you see, these are universals, right? And one thing I want to make clear is, first of all, I totally get why you're concerned about these things, and they are very frustrating, and they are things that students need to work on. But I also want to reassure you that for the vast majority of your students, they're not necessarily developmentally inappropriate, right? There's reasons that they are where they are. Restating the evidence, no depth of complexity, complete sentences, commas, generalities. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of things repeat here. So this is good. You're not alone. You'll notice in the chat, at least one person probably had the exact same concern that you do. Plagiarism, where does that fall in the developmental arc? We'll talk about that a little bit. There's a lot of reasons for plagiarism, and they're not all developmental, but some of them are. Okay, so I'm going to move us on to our next slide here. I'm going to click on my PowerPoint, and then I'm going to move us to the next slide. No, apparently that's not going to work. There we go. All right, so I want to look at some research that has been done by a cognitive psychologist named Ronald Kellogg. He started working on writing, I think, in the 90s, and he's building on work that was done in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So psychologists have been looking specifically at what happens in the brain as writers write and how that changes over the lifetime of an author. And one thing that they've noted is that writing skills seem to develop over a course of more than 2 decades. It's kind of that 10,000 hour rule of thumb that we use for things like becoming a violin virtuoso or a chess master. This takes a long time, many, many hours of practice, and it's sort of part of actual sort of human maturity and growth also. And as our skills progress in writing, the type and the amount of work that's performed by our brains actually changes. So 2 things I want to point out right here. First of all, obviously, you can't give them 10,000 hours of practice, right? This is a skill they're going to have to build over a lifetime. You've got them for an hour a day, maybe a few days a week for 9 months. So what you can do in that amount of time is teach them some skills that will transfer so that they can continue using those skills as they build their writing over the years. And you can also motivate them to continue putting in the hours. So helping them see why investing energy in writing is a good use of their time. The other thing I want to point out is that we talk about skills progressing. Progress in writing skills is usually uneven. Even expert writers are going to regress. For example, when they write about content that's new to them, or they address an unfamiliar audience, or they write in a new language. That's a classic example. If you're writing in a language that's not familiar, you're going to revert and you're going to be working at a lower skill level. And that's just universal. Okay, so a writer's brain, as we develop, it gradually learns to handle more tasks simultaneously, more stuff going on cognitively, and at higher levels of complexity. It takes the brain a while to figure out how to do this, to build neural pathways and build that capacity. The writer, the human being surrounding the brain, meanwhile, is learning some behaviors and some techniques that help the brain to function at this higher level. So we're kind of learning behaviors and habits that support the brain activity. The brain activity is things like matching vocabulary to mental concepts and remembering how to spell words correctly and how to physically write a word or where things are on the keyboard. The behaviors that we're talking about can be as basic as starting early and going back to revise. That is a key behavior for most writers, and it's crucial to allowing the brain to work the way it needs to work for expert level writing. When the TEKS talk about recursive practice, those are the habits that we want students to build. And some of those behaviors are a little more technical. So the cognitive psychologists talk about, they use this term that the brain, learning to automate certain skills and tasks so that to free up bandwidth basically in the brain. So when they talk about automation, they're not talking about machines, they're not talking about technology at all. They're talking about a process where the brain can do a task without having to devote sort of conscious attention to it. So once you've learned to touch type, for example, you don't have to think about where the letters are on the keyboard. That would be an example of automation. And so as with more practice, the brain learns to automate some things so that you don't have to think consciously about them. That's a key example for writing in a second language. When you're writing in a native language, you have pretty good command over vocabulary recall. That's more or less automatic. If you're writing in a language that's new to you, you may have to stop and think about what word you want, or you may even have to go look it up in a dictionary. So that process has not been automated in your brain yet. Okay. So we're going to look at 3 general stages of writing skills development that these cognitive psychologists have observed. They move from the novice level, where we start out in childhood, to maturity, and then to an expert level. But as I've already said, the progress through stages, it's not necessarily uniform. We can often see traits from more than one stage in a single piece of writing, and the skills, it's not just the skills may regress at times, skills will always regress for a writer at certain points in their career. So you'll see regression pretty often too, and that's normal, right? Every time they confront a new context or a new audience, they're going to regress, right? It's not developmentally inappropriate. So when the TEKS talks about doing things appropriately according to context, content, and audience, that's assuming a lot, because you have to be exposed to multiple audiences. You have to be exposed to multiple contexts in order to be able to write well for each one. And one piece of advice that I like to spout to administrators pretty often is, you cannot call something remedial if the student's never been exposed to it before. So a lot of the things that we look at and we think, why can't they do that? Well, they've never really been asked to. We're going to get into that in a little more detail. But overall, it's the direction of these 3 stages. We want to keep them moving along the arc, moving forward on this arc. Okay. So Kellogg calls these 3 stages knowledge telling, which is where we all start out, and then a sort of mature stage that he calls knowledge transforming, that's characteristic of adult writers. And then a higher skill level called knowledge crafting, that's more like workplace writing that we have to do for bigger audiences and for more context and more varied contexts. So Bereiter and Scardamalia are these two earlier psychologists here, but I liked it the way that they talked about the three stages. They talk about the key distinction among the stages lies in how knowledge is brought into the writing process and in what happens to knowledge in the process. So this is an important point. It's not just that the writing looks different or better for each of the three stages. What's really different for what's going on in the writer's brain is the way knowledge is being handled and developed by the writer, right? That's what really changes for writers. As we move from the knowledge telling stage, which is basically just reporting ideas, we start to build new ideas and to build more complex relationships between ideas. So that process is what we note as expert writers move forward. And then too, the recursiveness, the skill, the habit of returning and revising, that becomes more and more important as writing skill progresses, in part because we have this increasing cognitive load. So I'm going to show you a little schematic here. And this is from one of Kellogg's papers. This is the way he graphed out what he sees as the stages of cognitive development of writing skill. So if we look at this vertical axis, that's increasing writing skill going up. And the left to right axis is kind of development over time. So this is the arc that he's seeing, that your arc of writing skill goes up as you move forward on your developmental timeline. So these little bubbles here are what are really important. Here we have the first stage, knowledge telling, and we're going to drill into each of these stages in much more detail in the next few slides, but I wanted to kind of give you this big picture. In knowledge telling, you can think of this little circle as a sort of a little thought bubble in the writer's mind while they're working. And each bubble is a specific conception or understanding of the text that they're producing. So part of the developmental process involves the increasing ability to see the text from more than one perspective and to see multiple representations of the text simultaneously. So at the knowledge telling stage, the writer basically has one conception of the text, and it's what they're thinking as the author, right? When we move, it's sort of what I'm saying to the page. When we move to the knowledge transforming stage, it's more complex. And in the writer's brain, we have one formulation of the text, which is what I'm saying. And we have another understanding of the text of what the page is saying back to me. When we move on to knowledge crafting, we add a third layer to this. So the knowledge crafting writer has a stable understanding in their head of what they want to say as an author. They also understand that there is a text that reads a little bit differently from what they had in their mind. And they understand further that there is a real reader out there, a human being who's going to read that text and make assumptions about it and see it in a certain way that's going to be separate from these other two things. Okay, so knowledge crafting adds how a reader's going to react to what's on the page. Okay, so let's drill down into each of these. The knowledge telling stage is basically using writing to tell what the author knows. So in the brain, when this is going on, the planning activity is generally limited to idea retrieval. I'm fetching some ideas from my memory and I'm writing them down on the page with the words that I know. And the ideas don't change much as they're retrieved from memory and put onto the page. And reviewing and revising activity are typically minimal. So here's this fabulous little cartoon that I drew for you of my happy writer, and they're writing their happy paper, and this is what they're imagining that the text is. This is me saying my thing. That's what the writing is to them at this stage. They're just kind of reporting out. This is the first kind of writing that most children do. And a simple example would be on my happiest birthday ever. We had cake and presents and my grandma was there. I'm just reporting to you what I remember of this event in my life. The recall process that the brain is using is very similar to the process we use in oral conversation. So when we had people noticing in the chat that their students write like they talk, this is where they are. They're using this recall process because it helps with fluency. We can recall easily for oral conversation because we do that a lot. So we're going to use that same process when we are at the knowledge telling stage, just get those ideas out on paper. And the end result then, what you see on the page is generally a restatement of the writer's thoughts. There's not a lot of development here. It's just kind of reporting out what I was able to remember. So note that this is the kind of activity that's actually required by most timed writing tasks and standardized writing tests. So our students get a lot of experience, they get a lot of practice with this, and they tend to be pretty good at it. This kind of writing can incorporate outside sources. If you think about, you know, here's a prompt, read it and use some information from it in your answer, or look something up in a book, right? But the key is that, again, the ideas do not change much as they are translated to the page. So you can get knowledge telling in a research paper, for example, and we sometimes call that like a data dump paper. The student's not really telling us anything new. They're just kind of copying things from the encyclopedia or wherever they found them. So they do need to practice this, and they need to get good at it before they can move on. This kind of writing activity is helping them automate certain tasks and just get comfortable with the idea of putting ideas down on paper. So they're automating tasks like idea retrieval, vocabulary selection, sentence construction, spelling, and typing or writing. They have to do this before they can advance, but we don't want them stuck here. We don't want them to think that this is all that writing is. And a lot of them even get to college thinking that this is all that writing is. If they just do this and they clean up the sentences, they should be good, because very often they'll score very highly on standardized tests just by doing this. So what we want them to do is move on to stage 2, which is what Kellogg called knowledge transforming. And here's the little cartoon that I drew for you. Here's our happy writer again. Here's their understanding of themselves saying the thing they want to say. And then here's their new understanding that this stuff lands on a text and becomes something else that will transmit to another audience. I'm going to get to the English language learners in a bunch more slides, but we are going to talk about them a little bit. Okay, so in the brain, in this little happy person's brain, as they're writing, while they're retrieving ideas and composing the text to report those ideas out, the writer also starts to consider whether the text says what she wanted it to say and whether she herself agrees with what the text says. And in the process of those activities in the brain, the writer starts to contemplate potential changes in the text and potential changes in what she wants to say. So, for example, a writer might go back to that earlier sentence about the happy birthday and think, what did I really mean by happy here? A writer who's come back to that more reflectively might realize one reason I was in a good mood was that my uncle didn't come to the party and I was afraid of him. So really, was happy the right word to use? And they may just kind of sit with that and confront that a little bit. So this stage is marked by an awareness that once an idea is written down, that text becomes something apart from the writer, and it can have a powerful and recursive effect back upon the writer. And I like to say that a key place where we see knowledge transforming, that transition happening, is in tweens and teens when they start to write poetry, because they get some words down on paper and they look at it and they have this moment of revelation that, like, oh my gosh, I am so much more profound than I ever realized as a person, right? And they want to stay with that and kind of work those ideas more. But it doesn't always have to be quite that profound. It's simply that realization that I wrote these words and now I'm looking at them and I see that there's a meaning there that I hadn't originally intended. There's a potential meaning there that I could explore. It might be closer to what I wanted to say in the first place. Maybe it's an even smarter, better idea than I originally realized I had. And maybe it's more important to express that meaning than the one that I originally intended. So notice that choices start to become a factor here. When I'm just recalling memories and writing them down on paper, I'm not having to choose a whole lot. I might choose to tell you about some things and not others. But here, I have to start thinking about what I believe and what I understand and what makes sense to me and what I want to, how I want to try and explain that to other people. So we have divergent possibilities opening up, and the writer needs to make decisions about the best path to pursue. As our ideas become more complicated, this is what better writing skill is about. It's by having more complicated ideas. That means we have more opportunities, we have more choices, and we have to exercise more control. And that can freak people out. And it requires us to give up some of our sense of safety of doing the right thing. And so, and I'm sure you know this, that for a lot of your students, writing has become a thing. For them, the challenge is not to get things wrong, not to get into trouble. They want to stay safe. They want to do the thing that's going to get them the okay grade and get them out of it, because it is a really uncomfortable task for them. So If you see the job of writing as a process of avoiding mistakes and punishment, it's very difficult to want to stay in a place where you have a lot of choices and you don't really know which is the best one, right? So we have to make it worthwhile to the student to explore those other paths, or at least not punish them for exploring those paths, right? So if they find writing uncomfortable and painful, and if they lack confidence in the reception their writing will get, they will resist the work of exploring divergent creative possibilities at this stage. And what they'll learn to do instead is to kind of mimic development through things like what we saw in the chat, repetition and quoting and adopting a few stock phrases and platitudes to throw in there so that they sound like they're being reflective, right, instead of doing the work. And that's because the choices that open up at the knowledge transforming stage can be really terrifying to writers who don't feel confident in their ability to do that well. So kind of summing up here, what did I use to create the illustrations? That was, I drew them with a Sharpie and then I scanned them in. Thank you for asking. Okay, so knowledge transforming, in this stage of the writer's development, the act of writing becomes a way of building new representations of knowledge rather than simply retrieving old ones. There's sort of a fermentation process going on here in the brain. And there's also this really extensive interaction in the brain centers among planning, language generation, and reviewing activities. So there's just, the lights are just kind of going ping, ping, ping all around the brain while the writer is working. The text that you get at the end of the process is a really condensed version of the author's thought process. So rather than just my memories, here's kind of the way I worked through these ideas, is what you'll see. So when we lament the lack of depth or development in student writing, it's this threshold we're noticing that they haven't crossed. We don't just want static thoughts spelled out. We want to see some growth on the page. And again, this is something that is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because they may get pretty good at this in high school, writing about, texts that they're familiar with or personal experiences. They get to college, they start confronting new knowledge in new domains, their major or whatever. And suddenly they just kind of want to repeat things from the lecture in the textbook. They don't want it. They don't really know how to turn it into something new. So they have to kind of grapple with the new content before they can get back to this stage. So again, that regression is totally normal. Note that this is not the kind of activity that's typically associated with timed writing and time testing. On a time test, you really don't want the student changing what they think, right? You don't want them to get in a situation where they're like, oh, I have 15 possibilities here. Let me take half an hour to think through them and decide which one I want to write about. Can't do that in a time test. They got to pick one and go with it, provide evidence, whatever the prompt is asking them to do. So the way that our educational system is focused so much on time testing is really pushing students to avoid kind of knowledge transforming forward development in their writing. But it is what we want them to do well in college, and it is the kind of activity that makes writing worthwhile as a cognitive activity. It's the kind of thing that makes your brain grow. So that's why we need them to do it. And the TEKS refers to generating ideas through a range of, I'm sorry, I always kind of, when I quote the TEKS, I always kind of do this pose. Generating ideas through a range of strategies, such as brainstorming and journaling, developing an engaging idea reflecting depth of thought with specific details, examples, and commentary. So to get to that, they have to learn how to see the potential for development first in that knowledge telling text and be able to like push it out into something else. So that's really a very high level skill, and acquiring that skill is a very messy process and takes some time. All right, stage 3, the knowledge crafting stage. And I just realized that Zoom has hidden my clock, so I have no idea where I am on time. Okay, 10:30, right. Okay, so at the knowledge crafting stage, we have a writer. Here's our writer. Here's their understanding of the text that they want to say. Here's their understanding of what comes out on the page. We now add a third player in the brain while they're writing. That is this reader who's receiving the message from the text and is having a whole possible range of responses to it. So this is a live presence in the writer's brain while they're writing at the knowledge crafting stage. What's going on here is that while they're composing and reviewing, revising, the writer can imagine with a high degree of specificity how a reader is likely to interpret the text. And this comes from Walter Ong, who says that writers must be able to correctly anticipate all the ways in which a reader might misunderstand them. So both of those already established representations of the text are analyzed for potential reader interpretation. So if we go back to our birthday party example, the writer at this stage might ask, well, what are readers going to infer if I tell them that my uncle wasn't there and I was afraid of them? What's that going to make them expect? What's it going to make them think? If I use the word afraid, how are they going to react to that? And how should I manage their potential responses? So, if I'm writing for an audience of social workers, I might think that, they might jump to assumptions about trauma if I talk about my uncle and being afraid of him. But this can also mean awareness of the reader down to the level of, is this clause going to confuse them? Is a person who's not inside my brain going to be able to read through the sentence and understand who is doing what to whom? So the writer has to anticipate all of those audience needs. One key fact about this stage also is that just as the text representation could change what the writer wants to think and say, reader response can also change what we think and say. And if you are fortunate enough to have been published as a writer, you know that having readers can change everything. It will make you interrogate every word you put down on the page. So actually, I probably should have edited this cartoon so that the person maybe doesn't look quite so happy anymore, because this is a really cognitively fatiguing way to use your brain. All right. So knowledge crafting means being able to predict how an audience will react to ideas we present, and even how they'll navigate a sentence. And doing that requires two things: imagination and empathy. Right. So those are skills that don't come up in the TEKS a whole lot, but they're really key to a writer's development. Keeping those three representation of the text active in working memory as we write is incredibly cognitively taxing. So as you all know, if you write something and go back and revise it, every time you do it, typically you step away from it and you're like, oh, I'm so tired. My brain is so tired, right? So writers, again, talking about building the habits, writers learn to manage that cognitive load in large part through recursive practices. So our first pass through draft may be just spitting out all the ideas we have in our brain. Our second pass may mean coming back and thinking about, okay, what do I see on the page? I can see the page now because I'm not just focused on my brain, and I can have a conversation between the writer representation and the text representation. And then it may mean coming back a third time and thinking, okay, what is my audience really going to get out of this? And how do I need to guide that and shape that response? So that lets the brain kind of focus on one thing at a time, kind of rotate among those multiple representations so that they're all three in the brain, but you get to kind of focus the cognitive prefrontal cortex on one at a time and spread it out over time. So you make sure that all three of them are fully considered. Again, the TEKS standards refers, really dry phrasing, that we want writing that is appropriate to purpose, audience, topic, and context. But that's a critical piece of the communicative task, is being able to imagine the reader's response. And a lot of times our students are having to guess at what an audience actually means. So we can give them some basic, you're writing for readers of this newspaper, or you're writing for the person who's spending 30 seconds grading your essay exam for the STAR test. But they're always really sort of mysterious. And so they don't have that. It takes, my theory is, you have to provide, we're gonna get to this in just a second, you have to provide real readers for students so that they can really learn to build that representation, that third representation in their brain, and understand what a reader wants from them. But anyway, those recursive processes and habits are sort of a pressure valve that let the prefrontal cortex rotate its attention among the three representations. Okay, so now what can we do with this? How can we use this framework to help writers? Really boils down to two simple things. We can prioritize two things that we know will move them forward. Create a dialogue between the writer and their writing. So help them hear the page, talk back to them. And that's going to help move them from knowledge telling to knowledge transforming. Get them in the habit of understanding that what they said is different from what's on the page, and they need to have that sort of conversation back and forth. And then the second thing is to give them real readers, and that sets them up to do knowledge crafting. Real means anybody who reads for meaning and can use feedback to clarify the meaning of the writing. So that can mean a lot of different things. We're going to go through some examples here. Okay. All right. So I'm trying to check in the chat here, but I think I'm going to cover a lot of what you're bringing up. If not, we'll get to it in the Q&A. Okay, so first of all, responding as a reader. A lot of you probably already do this, but I just want to focus on it for a minute to say it is absolutely a good investment of your time. And if you're doing it, keep it up. And if you're not doing it, give it a try. When you respond to student writing, try to foreground the reader's reactions, questions, and any confusion rather than correctness. That doesn't mean you don't ever talk about grammar rules, but don't start with that and don't make it the focus. So instead of saying this is a comma splice or you have a lot of comma splices, try saying instead something like parts of the sentence are connected in a way that makes it hard to understand who's doing what. If I read this, I run out of breath. By the time I get to the end of the sentence, I'm lost and I have to go back to the beginning again and I can't understand you, okay? There's two benefits here. One is that responding that way provides a concrete example of a reader reacting to the text. That's an actual brain thing that they have to build, that reader representation of the text. If all they get is grammar rules, like that's not a stable thing that the brain can really hold while it's working with writing. But that sort of voice in their head, a lot of you probably had a teacher at some point who worked with you on your writing. I've found this is a very common experience, and people will say, you know, when I write, a lot of times I hear that person's voice in my head, or I imagine I'm writing for that person. That's a stable reader representation. So when you respond to your students' writing as a reader using this kind of language, you're helping build that representation in there for them. And that's going to be useful to them in all the writing that they do going forward. Oh, did I hit all my notes here? Okay. This also provides a concrete example of a reader reaction to the text. It also directs the writer back to the words on the page to reassess their potential meaning. So you also get some kind of knowledge transforming activity here where I have to go back to the text and realize, oh, I thought I said this, but in fact, the words of the page actually said this. That's why my reader got confused, okay? So grammar and mechanics are important, but they're really only important because they can affect comprehension. So the simple solution really to cover all your bases is to address grammar and mechanics most of the time in the context of reader confusion. All right, and you do that by responding as a reader. Okay. Eliminate potential misreadings, and this goes back to Ong saying that we need to anticipate all the ways a reader can misinterpret. So show them how the reader can stray off the intended path. When you wrote that she fed steak to her dog in a silver bowl, I thought the dog was in the bowl. You don't have to have a discussion about modifiers in English and proximity to their modified nouns and where it has to go. Just say, I thought the dog was in the bowl. Most writers are going to be able to figure out what the problem is and at least attempt to fix at that point. And that way also the writer has to figure it out themselves. That way they're building a transferable skill, okay? You can also help them hear small scale problems. So read a sentence or two aloud to highlight missing words or agreement problems or any other little blips like that. I've done a lot of research on audiovisual feedback. And one thing that comes up when you do that is, first of all, when you communicate vocally with a student or face-to-face, so that facial expression is also involved, you can communicate a lot of confusion or comprehension just through vocal inflection or facial expression. As humans, we are socialized to look for those cues. So that kind of feedback I have found tends to be much more efficient and effective than writing down, I was confused here. If they see you making that face, I don't understand this. That's gonna register and it's gonna stay with them better. What I've also found in my research on AV feedback, this is kind of an aside, but I think it's important. The prefrontal cortex, when we're writing, we know it's having to sort of manage these three jugglers, these three versions of the text as it's working. So when a student is trying to process feedback that you've given them, if it's written feedback, you're kind of adding a fourth juggler onto the stage that they have to deal with. The prefrontal cortex is having to add all that in, and it reduces the cognitive, so it increases the cognitive load. If you are providing some feedback about the writing, about the reader's response to the writing, the reader's comprehension or confusion, if you're providing that through vocal or visual facial cues, like facial expression cues, my hypothesis is, because of the way our brains are wired, that sort of social information, vocal inflection and facial expression, they're processed through a different part of the brain. They're not processed really through the prefrontal cortex, but they still register. So the writer is able to absorb all this information about the writing and about the reader response to it without soaking up bandwidth in the prefrontal cortex that's working on the writing. So it seems to provide a back channel. I had very good results when I tried this with my students. I would just make a video of me reading their paper, and then I would give them feedback at the end. And just the experience of seeing me like struggle to get through a sentence and watching my facial expressions, it really motivated them to revise in different ways than they did when I gave them written feedback. So, so any way that you can provide information about reader confusion or reader response to even minor problems in the text, probably going to be more efficient use of your time and their time. Responding this way is going to help students that teach 9C about revising drafts to improve clarity, development, organization, style, diction, and sentence effectiveness. Like the TEKS gives you like 7 things that they have to do well. Using this kind of feedback style is going to help with all of those. You don't even have to focus on one at a time. It's going to lift them all. So, okay. So the other bonus here, when we talk about engagement and keeping students, involved with their writing skills over 10,000 hours, the bonus here is that giving them this task of, you have to help the reader understand, much more rewarding than you have to correct your bad grammar, right? They are just much more likely to engage and stay with the process if you frame it as the writer wants to understand you and needs some help for that, rather than you have transgressed against the laws of grammar and you must pay the penalty, right? Who would not choose the first over the second? Remind them that reading is hard work and that readers need a lot of help from the writer. E.B. White says the average reader is in trouble about 50% of the time, and I find that accurate. And remind them that readers have definite expectations, and when those expectations are not met, confusion and misreading results. So when you're modeling that for them, oh, I read it this way, and I guess you meant it that way, right? That's going to show them the pitfalls of not being clear. So it's really important here to show, not just tell. Show them the reader's confusion. Show them that the audience expected something else. It's going to have a bigger impact. So if you want engagement, make sure that they feel heard. Make sure that they know somebody's reading their writing and trying to understand them. Okay. Use questions to encourage knowledge transforming. I use this, did you mean X or did you mean Y? Did you mean that the dog was in the bowl? That's kind of weird. Is that what you meant? That's a productive way to unpack tangled sentences. And it can also reveal places where the writer isn't really sure what they mean, all right? And that's a sign that they're in transit from knowledge telling to knowledge transforming. Now, a caveat, if you ask them that and they're not sure what they mean, very common response is that they're just going to cut the whole sentence, right? They'll often just try to cut out any text that raises new potential meanings because it's scary and it's like, oh, that's going to be a lot of work to figure out. I don't want to have to figure out what I meant. I just want to, say what needed to be said correctly. So you have to convince them to stick with it. You have to convince them that expressing complicated ideas is their goal. And really the way to do that is just to take an interest in their ideas, to say, no, I want to know what you thought, right? I want to know what you meant by that. I'm interested, I'm curious, let me know, right? It can be really helpful for them to talk through these moments, right? When they aren't sure what they want to say, because trying to get them to figure it out in writing, what they've already written takes on oversized importance. It feels kind of fossilized, like a brick wall. And if they pull one brick out, the whole thing could come down. So getting them to do it verbally first may make it easier for them. The ideas will feel a little more malleable. So let them, we want to get them to comfortable staying in that sort of messy place where the ideas aren't settled yet and they're free to move them around, like Dr. Strange, But if they're not comfortable being in that messy place on paper, let them do it verbally, taking a few notes, and then they can translate that into written text. Verbalizing some potential reader interpretations can also help them feel less like they're being interrogated. So instead of just saying, what did you mean here? What did you mean here? I don't understand what you're talking about. Say, did you mean this or did you mean that? Let your brain, so model that process of kind of meandering down the various paths that the sentence or the passage presents to the reader, and just say, oh, I went down here and I seem to be hitting a dead end. Let me come back and try this meaning. Does this meaning work? So they can see, first of all, that they're making the reader do that work, which they should have done, but also so that they don't have to feel like, under the spotlight of, I'm being asked what I mean. I should say something coherent. It's okay to not really know and to try to figure it out. That's one reason we write, right? Okay, so using peer review is something that I always recommend, because everybody I talk to in education has the problem of not having enough resources to devote to writing instruction. But what we do have a lot of is students, and you can have them be readers for one another. Simply having them read their work aloud for each other will help them find and correct a lot of problems, even if they don't necessarily do a lot of chatting around it. They can read their own work, or they can swap papers and read each other's work. But if you're going to do more than that, you want to give them some specific guidance and model the kind of feedback you want them to offer each other. So at the end of this presentation, I have a slide with a link to Shelley Reed's page at George Mason University. She has a really specific heuristic for peer review that goes through for any particular situation, like what do you want to accomplish with this particular peer review? And then she gives you suggestions for how to set it up and what to tell them to do. It's important to remember the research on peer review shows that the primary benefit doesn't necessarily, they're not necessarily going to give each other brilliant advice about what to change about their writing, but there seems to be something about the process of looking at another writer's work, somebody who's engaged with a similar task that you're working on, and having to articulate what's good about it, what was confusing to you, what could be better. That seems to provide a big benefit to writing skills development and transferable skills. It kind of puts the peer reviewer in that place of being, understanding the reader mindset for this assignment. Oh, this is how, I did this in my writing. I bet readers are going to react the same way, right? So don't despair if you don't hear brilliant editorial advice coming from them. Coach them, just as I was advising to you, to respond as readers. Talk about what confuses you, what you think the writer might have meant, and then they can talk about, they can, offer feedback to one another and suggestions and hash it out. Help them prioritize. And I can't remember if I had this on a slide already. Oh yeah, I have it here. Okay, so finally, help them prioritize. When a student gets feedback from you or from a peer, try to help them make a plan to do something with it. This is a skill that they can take forward with them into other situations as well. So what do they think they should do first? What do they think will be hardest? What do they think they might want help with? If they can walk away with some concrete sense of what they're going to do, then they're much more likely to engage productively in the revision process. So a good rule of thumb is maybe give them 3 things to work on, or ask them to choose 3 things and put them in order from what they think is most important or what they want to do first. And the TEKS C9 and C10 that deal with composition, those are the obvious application here. But this approach will also build skills for all that C5 and C4 and C8, the listening, speaking, reading, writing, thinking using multiple texts. Because these aren't necessarily literary texts that they're working with, but they're getting this experience of reading critically, discussing with other writers, and then thinking about their own writing so that they can practice these kind of skills. And they'll get, if you work with their own writing this way, they tend to get better at engaging with literary texts because they're thinking about that author as a writer like themselves. Like, these are the problems that writers have. These are the choices writers have to make. So now I have a better way to critique what this author was working with as they were, trying to address this particular audience or whatever it was that they were doing. And just one more time, want to point out the TEKS uses this phrase, appropriate audience. That's a loaded term if students are just guessing about their audience. So you want to make the audience real to them and make it human. And that's a skill they can transfer from one audience to another. So if they're stepping into a situation where they're writing for an audience they don't know, at least they can think, well, these are people. I'm talking to people. How do I think about that? So the skills of imagination and empathy really are a bit more important than the sort of, well, I'm writing for professionals in the engineering sector. How do they think? Those are things you can look up. Imagination and empathy you have to build as skills. Okay, so that's the end of this part of the presentation.